The throne room of the kingdom of Arelon was silent. Stone pillars carved with dragon-wrought emblems loomed high overhead, their shadows stretching across the velvet carpet like ancient sentinels. Sunlight filtered through stained glass, casting red, gold, and sapphire hues over the marbled floor. Nobles in fine robes stood on either side, their hands clasped, waiting with bated breath for the declaration. Cael stood at the center of it all. Mud-streaked boots planted firmly on sacred tile, his armor scorched and dented from the final battle against the Demon Lord's vanguard. His brown hair, once trimmed for discipline, now hung in loose tufts over a bandaged brow. In his left hand, he held the polished sword that had felled nightmares. In his right, a wooden cooking spoon, charred at the tip. "Cael, son of Relon, guardian of the western ranges," the royal steward bellowed, his voice echoing like a drumbeat through the hall. "Slayer of Gorgoras the Defiler, savior of Twinhold, bearer of the hero's flame. You are summoned before his majesty to receive the laurel of ascension." The king stepped forward. Golden robes swept the floor. His silver crown glittered, and in his hands he held a circlet lined with white pearls and dragon's tooth, a sacred token. The laurel of ascension, a crown bestowed only once every generation to the kingdom's greatest protector. The crowd stirred, preparing to erupt in cheers, but Cael did not kneel. Instead, he bowed his head respectfully and whispered, "I can't accept this." The room froze. The king blinked, lips parted mid-blessing. The steward lowered the scroll in confusion. Cael raised his eyes. "I thank you, your majesty, for the trust, for the honor, but I'm not the hero you want." A stunned silence fell, followed by murmurs, sharp and uneasy. "I did what I could to end the war, but I didn't fight for glory or titles. I fought so people could live quiet lives. I want that too. A quiet life." The princess gasped softly. Somewhere in the audience, a noblewoman dropped her fan. The king finally spoke, his voice calm, though tinged with disbelief. "You would turn down the laurel? The title? The estate? The command of the royal knights?" Cael nodded once. "I'm not meant to sit in marble halls or command armies. I was never truly part of that world. My dreams are simpler and far humbler." "What is it that you do wish for?" the king asked, his voice barely above a murmur. Cael cracked the faintest smile, lifting the charred spoon in his hand. "A cart, a pen, and maybe a pinch of sea salt." 3 days later, the gates of the capital swung open just after dawn. There was no ceremony, no send-off, no guards in formation. Cael walked alone. His old armor had been exchanged for a simple brown tunic and travel cloak. Slung over his shoulder was a worn pack stuffed with herbs, utensils, and 3 jars of preserved garlic comfit. At his hip, a heavy iron pan, lovingly seasoned. His sword, left behind in the capital's vaults. The only companion he took was a rickety wooden wagon hitched to a docile mule named Beans. In the wagon, under a canvas tarp, sat a stack of pots, a crate of vegetables, and a folded wooden sign painted with crude letters. "Cael's Campfire Kitchen, hot meals, honest prices." As the morning mist rolled across the valley, Cael took one last look at the stone towers of Arelon behind him, then turned forward to the open road. The air smelled of wild lavender and dew. His stomach rumbled. "A good start," he muttered to himself, adjusting the pack. "Let's find someone hungry." He reached the outskirts of a modest farming village by dusk. The inn was closed for renovations, the local tavern underwhelmed, and the townsfolk were too tired to cook after a long harvest day. Cael saw his chance. Within minutes, he'd unpacked his cart, stacked firewood, and had a pan sizzling over open flame. The scent of caramelized onions and spiced lentils drifted through the square. Children gathered first, peeking around barrels and giggling as the former hero flipped flatbread in the air. Then came a few wary farmers, leaning on rakes and hoes. Finally, the village elder approached, squinting. "You're Cael, the demon slayer?" "Cael, the cook, now. The sword's retired, but I still know how to fight hunger." The elder took a spoonful, his eyes widening. Merciful stars! The bowl was empty in seconds. Others followed. By nightfall, Cael had served nearly 24 meals, each seasoned with quiet joy. Coins clinked into his jar, more than enough to restock. But what mattered most was the calm, the warmth, the peaceful, flickering fire. He wasn't defending a kingdom anymore. He was feeding it. Later, as Cael packed up under a starlit sky, a child approached and handed him a crudely drawn picture, him with a big pan, smiling, surrounded by happy villagers. "You're better than a knight," she whispered. He smiled and ruffled her hair. "Don't tell the knights that." As the night deepened and the villagers slept full and content, Cael laid back on a bundle of hay beside his cart. Crickets chirped, a breeze rustled the canvas. There were no horns of war, no politics, no glory, just peace and the lingering scent of stew. And somewhere, in the distance, unseen and massive, something primal stirred, a beast drawn by the memory of flavor. But for now, Cael slept. The merchant had begun his journey, and the world would never be the same.
The morning sun shimmered through a thin veil of clouds as Cael steered his cart down the dusty path that twisted through the elm-shade hills. The mule, Beans, plodded along with the same slow determination as always, snorting occasionally as if offering commentary on the terrain. Behind them, the village of Glenmere faded into the horizon, a place now filled with full bellies and rumors of a war hero turned cook. Cael tried not to think about the whispers. He didn't want to be remembered as the hero of Erelon. He'd left that name behind, along with the gilded halls and suffocating expectations. Out here, on the road, he was just a traveling merchant with a knack for seasoning and a dream stitched together with garlic, broth, and cast iron. His cart rattled over stones and roots as he hummed softly to himself, keeping rhythm with Beans's lazy pace. The landscape stretched wide and green, broken by golden fields, meadows, and patches of dense woodland. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional rabbit darted across the road. It was the kind of quiet that most warriors found unbearable, but Cael savored it. With no battles to win and no titles to uphold, he could finally hear the world breathe. By noon, he reached a fork in the road. To the west lay the trade city of Marwick, bustling, loud, and cutthroat with competition. To the east, a cluster of sleepy hamlets nestled beneath the green march forest. Cael stared between the signs for a long while, chewing on a strip of dried beef. "I suppose Marwick has coin, but Greenmarch has mushrooms." Beans sneezed and turned toward the east. Cael chuckled. "So we agree. Mushrooms it is." The Green March road narrowed, shaded by towering oaks and whispering leaves. The scent of pine mixed with damp earth and wild mint. As Cael traveled deeper, he kept an eye out for forageables, thistle bulbs, woodier mushrooms, and spring onions. By late afternoon, he'd filled the small sack with herbs and fungi, humming happily as he walked. At a small clearing where the sunlight filtered in dappled gold, Cael parked his cart and lit a fire. Soon the gentle sizzle of oil in the pan danced with the breeze. He added diced shallots, garlic, and the wild mushrooms, stirring slowly. The aroma was warm, earthy, and comforting. "This," he said to himself, "is what magic really smells like." Just as he began plating a few test portions of his wild mushroom risotto, he heard rustling in the trees. Then footsteps, soft but not careful. Someone was approaching. From the shadows emerged the pair of travelers, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a crossbow strapped to his back, and a teenage girl with fiery red hair tucked under a patchy hood. They looked road-weary, their clothes dusty and torn. "Evening," he called cautiously, eyes scanning the camp. "We smelled food." Cael gestured to the fire. "You're just in time. Hungry?" The girl stepped forward first, nose twitching like a rabbit. "Is that real cheese?" "Grated hard curd from a dairy in Westmere," Cael said proudly, scooping food into wooden bowls. The man accepted his bowl hesitantly, watching Cael with wary eyes. "What's a cook like you doing out here? It's not safe. Bandits have been prowling these roads." "Hadn't noticed. They must not like roasted chestnut soup." The man grunted a laugh despite himself. "Name's Hob. She's Mira. We're headed north. Heard there's work guarding caravans." "You two mercenaries?" "Used to be," Mira mumbled through a mouthful of rice. "Now we mostly try to survive." Cael nodded, understanding all too well the look in their eyes. People who'd seen too much, lost too much, and were just trying to stay ahead of the next blow. "Well, you're welcome to eat and rest a bit. No charge." Hob raised an eyebrow. "No charge?" Cael smiled. "First meal's free. Goodwill policy." The mercenary chuckled. "You are either very kind or very stupid." "Can it be both?" That night they shared stories by firelight. Hob recounted battles fought in the Iron Valleys. Mira told of monsters that hunted in moonlight. Cael, in turn, talked about a dish he once made during a snowstorm, boar stew with red wine and root vegetables, and how it saved a freezing village from starvation. He didn't mention the part where he'd also slain a frost giant that same day. They were gone by morning, leaving behind a few silver coins and a simple wooden carving of a pan, a thank-you gift, crudely whittled but heartfelt.
By the end of the week, Cael had visited 3 more towns. In each, he set up his food stall, cooked with whatever local ingredients he could find, and served hungry villagers with a smile. His reputation grew quietly, not as a warrior or a hero, but as the wandering chef. Children ran after his cart, grandmothers offered recipes, and wherever he went, stories followed. There were rumors, too, of strange tracks in the woods behind his cart, of glowing yellow eyes that watched over his camp but never struck, of a massive beast that lingered on the edge of the firelight, not as a threat, but as a guest. Cael heard the stories and said nothing. He just stirred his soup and waited, because something was watching, and soon it would come closer, drawn not by the scent of blood, but the promise of flavor. The early morning fog clung to the trees like ghostly vines as Cael's cart ambled along the quiet dirt path. Birds chirped softly overhead, and the air smelled of damped leaves and wood smoke. Beans, ever steady, pulled the cart without complaint. The clinking of pots and pans inside the wagon was the only real sound, a kitchen's heartbeat on wheels. Cael was in good spirits. The morning's foraging had been bountiful. He had gathered sweet root, wild sage, and even a cluster of honey-golden chanterelle mushrooms, perfect for roasting. His mind was already crafting a recipe, maybe a forest mushroom tart on flatbread with a drizzle of herb oil and sea salt. As he turned a bend near the riverbank, a rustle came from the trees. Then a shout, "Stop right there!" Cael pulled gently on Bean's reins. The mule huffed and obeyed. From the shadows ahead emerged 3 rough-looking men, bandits by their dress, their smirks wide and weapons drawn.
One had a rusted axe slung across his back, another carried twin daggers, and the third, the tallest, rested a crude blade lazily on his shoulder. "Well, well," said the tall one, stepping forward. "Looks like we've got ourselves a wandering merchant. What's in the cart, friend?" "Pots, vegetables, a block of cheese," Cael replied calmly. "And coin?" The dagger man grinned, stepping closer. "Just enough for restocking," Cael answered. "But I've got something better than coin." The leader raised an eyebrow. "Better than coin?" Cael reached slowly into the cart, deliberately, without alarm, and pulled out a flat iron pan. "Breakfast." The bandits blinked. Cael knelt by the roadside, built a small fire in practiced motions, and poured oil into the pan. He laid in slices of sweet root and shallots, then dropped in the chanterelles. A sprinkle of sage, a pinch of salt. The sizzle rose like a lullaby. The scent drifted like a warm spell. "I haven't eaten today. Figured I'd cook extra," Cael said, eyes focused on the pan. The bandit stood frozen, confused. The tall one frowned. You trying to bribe us with food?" "No. I'm inviting you to sit down and eat like decent men." Silence followed. Then almost involuntarily, the dagger-wielding man's stomach growled. The axeman coughed and muttered, "Smells better than anything I've had all week." Cael handed out 3 wooden plates and ladled generous portions onto each. He didn't speak. He didn't negotiate. He simply passed food and sat cross-legged by the fire, sipping from a tin cup of tea. The bandits hesitated, but hunger won out. One by one, they accepted the food and sat. No one talked for a while. Only chewing and the occasional appreciative grunt broke the air. After a few minutes, the tall one finally spoke. "You're not afraid of us." Cael shrugged. "I've seen worse things than men with swords." "You really would have cooked for us even if we didn't show up?" "I cook for whoever's hungry." The man lowered his blade to the ground. You're the guy they're talking about, the one with the beast rumors behind him, the wandering stew smith." Cael smiled softly. "I've been called worse." The dagger man looked down at his empty plate. "I ain't proud of what we do," he admitted. "But it's hard out here. Nobody hires a man with scars and no village." Cael stood and dusted off his hands. "Then come with me. Help me sell food, carry supplies, wash dishes, work for bread instead of stealing it." The men blinked in surprise. "You serious?" "I'm no saint," Cael said, walking toward his cart. "But I believe people change when their bellies are full and their hands are useful. I won't pay in gold, but I'll feed you 3 times a day, and you'll sleep by a fire, not in a ditch." The men looked at each other, uncertain, but in their eyes something shifted. Shame softened, pride cracked, and a flicker of something long buried, hope, stirred to life. "We'll think about it," said the tall one. Cael nodded. "Then think while we pack up." By dusk, the cart rolled into a roadside meadow overlooking the forest. Cael let the new recruits, whose names were Bram, Jaren, and Loke, set up the campfire under his direction. They were clumsy but willing, and they asked questions about spices, about boiling temperatures, about how to sharpen a knife for slicing instead of stabbing. Cael answered them all. That night, they made a wild onion soup with toasted barley bread, and it wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And just beyond the trees, a low growl rumbled in the dark. Yellow eyes blinked in the shadows, watching, waiting, drawn again not by fear, but by flavor. Cael sensed it. He didn't panic. He just stirred his soup and set another place at the table.
The hills began to steepen 2 days later, and the soil under Cael's feet turned rocky and uneven. The forests thinned as they rose into the foothills of the Velmoran peaks. An ancient range whispered about in stories, home to ghosts, spirits, and things that growled in the night. Cael, of course, had no interest in such tales. He was interested in truffles. The earth here was known to yield the black-rooted delicacies once every few seasons, and if he could find some, they'd fetch a fair trade in the next town. More importantly, shaved over roasted potatoes with goat butter, they made a dish so good it once stopped a bar fight mid-punch. Behind him, Beans trotted steadily along, pulling the cart. The ex-bandits, Bram, Jaren, and Loke, followed on foot, their moods improving by the day. They have taken to calling themselves the Fry-Pan Guard, jokingly sworn to protect Cael's holy skillet. Though awkward with spatulas and cutting boards, their efforts were genuine. Bram was learning to light a fire with one spark. Jaren was fascinated with seasoning. Loke, still reserved, silently scrubbed pots each night with a strange reverence, as if making up for every dirty deed he'd ever done. As the group climbed higher, the air grew thinner, crisper. They set up camp near a rocky ridge beside a narrow stream. Cael crouched near the water, rinsing a handful of wild onions. He looked up toward the mountain wall, where pine trees clung like stubborn sentries. That was when he heard it. A low, echoing growl, long, guttural, and resonant, as if the very stones of the mountain responded to it. He froze. Then, silence. "Did you hear that?" Bram asked, slowly reaching for the small knife he'd been slicing carrots with. "I heard," Cael replied quietly, standing. "It wasn't close, but it was big." Loke nodded slowly. "That wasn't a bear." "No," Cael agreed, eyes scanning the trees. "That was something else." That night, the fire crackled low, and the wind whistled through the cliffs. Cael didn't cook a full meal, just a quick barley stew, meant to be filling, not fragrant. But still, something came. He noticed it when he stepped outside the circle of firelight to wash his hands. There, in the far distance, just beyond the pine line, a silhouette. Massive, still, watching. He said nothing to the others. He didn't want panic. But as he lay under his blanket near the wagon, Cael kept one eye open, his hand resting not on a weapon, but on the skillet beside him. At dawn, fresh claw marks were discovered on a tree near the camp, deep, wide, and longer than a man's forearm. Loke paled. Jaren stood frozen, staring at the grooves in the bark. "What in all the gods' names made those?" he whispered. Cael knelt, studying the marks. He ran a finger along the grooves, noticing how clean they were. Something ancient, strong, territorial. He glanced at the ground. No prints. Whatever it was, it moved with care. "But it didn't strike," Cael said aloud, mostly to himself. "Could have attacked last night. We weren't exactly subtle." Bram looked at him. "You think it's hunting us?" Cael shook his head. "No. If it were, we'd be bones already. I think it's observing." That afternoon, Cael made a decision. He walked into the trees with a small satchel of ingredients and his skillet. "What are you doing?" Jaren asked nervously, following him halfway. "I'm leaving a message," Cael replied. He found a flat rock in a small glade where sunlight touched the moss and warmed the stones. There he set up a fire and prepared a meal. pan-seared root cakes with herbs, a drizzle of honey, and a dusting of aged cheese. Nothing fancy, but fragrant and inviting. When it was done, he plated it carefully, set it on a leaf, and placed it on the rock. Then he stepped back and left. By evening, he returned alone. The meal was gone. The plate untouched. No crumbs, no tracks. But beside the rock, nestled neatly in the moss, was something new. A single fang. Long, white, almost translucent. Too large to be human, too polished to be left by accident. Cael picked it up gently, turning it in his palm. "Well," he murmured, "you're welcome." Later that night, as the fry-pan guards settled around the campfire, Cael added a little extra spice to their stew and smiled softly to himself. Whatever was out there, whatever ancient beast stalked these mountains, it hadn't come with rage. It had come with curiosity and hunger. Cael didn't know what it was yet, but he was starting to understand one thing. Some monsters don't want to fight. Some just want to eat. And for the first time in centuries, perhaps, this one had finally tasted home cooking.
By now, the Velmarin peaks were fully behind them, but the presence that had trailed Cael and his companions lingered like mist that refused to burn off with the morning sun. Days passed, yet none of them forgot the sound of that growl echoing off stone, or the plate that vanished without a trace. The fang Cael had found now hung on a leather cord around his neck, not as a trophy, but as a message, a symbol. An offering had been accepted. A connection had been made. And something was still watching. It began with small signs. A haunch of smoked meat left hanging near the cart was gone in the morning, the rope cleanly sliced. The firewood stack was rearranged overnight, not stolen, not disturbed, just moved. Once Cael found paw prints near the stream that weren't there the day before, massive yet precise. They came to the water's edge, circled once, then vanished like vapor. Loke, ever the quiet one, muttered the words first. "It's following us." Jaren shook his head. "But why? If it wanted to eat us, it would have done it already." Cael stirred a pot of lentil stew over the fire. "Because hunger is more than appetite. Sometimes it's loneliness." Brahm snorted. "That thing? Lonely?" Cael glanced toward the tree line, the shadows darker than they should have been. "Even monsters need something warm now and then." They reached the village of Elthwyn just before sundown, a small farming outpost surrounded by fields of golden wheat. The townsfolk welcomed them cautiously at first, but once Cael opened the cart and the smell of fresh bread, thyme, and stew wafted through the air, suspicion gave way to smiles and hungry bellies. Children played around the camp. Old men clapped Cael on the back and praised his roasted chestnut soup. The mayor, a wiry woman with sharp eyes, gave them space in the market square and even donated a sack of potatoes as thanks. But that night, something changed. The wind picked up just after midnight. Not a storm, something colder, deeper. The fire crackled lower than it should have, and the air thickened with tension. Cael awoke before the others. He felt it. Something was near. He stepped softly around the cart, skillet in hand more like a shield than a weapon.
The stars above shimmered through thin clouds. Then he saw them. 2 golden eyes, glowing faintly from beyond the wheat field. Not malevolent, not aggressive, but hungry and waiting. Cael didn't run, didn't shout. He simply crouched near the fire and added more wood. Then he reached into his basket and began chopping. This time, he made rabbit stew. Fresh cuts of meat, wild onions, sage, a touch of citrus rind he'd bartered for earlier that day. The scent rose like a quiet song into the night. "I don't know what you are," Cael said softly as he stirred, speaking into the dark. "But I know this. Food isn't just for the body. It's for the soul, even a beast's." When the stew was done, he placed a bowl at the edge of the wheat field and waited. The golden eyes blinked once, then were gone. By morning, the bowl was empty, licked clean. The next day, Cael kept cooking. He made roasted squash with cinnamon and butter, smoked river trout on cedar planks. He left a little each night, and every morning it was gone. And each day the signs of their visitor grew bolder. Fresh paw prints near the camp, a tuft of silvery fur snagged on the cartwheel. Once, Loke swore he saw the shape, tall as a horse with a wolfish frame and antlers like dead branches, standing just at the forest edge before fading back into the trees. "It's stalking us," Jaren whispered, not fearfully, but with awe. "No," Cael said, "it's staying close." That night, the villagers heard the howl. Low, lonesome, deep as a canyon and long as sorrow. No creature had dared to come near Elfwyn for years. Now they trembled behind their doors. But Cael only sat at his fire, stirring rice into warm broth and adding a splash of goat's milk to soften the edge. As the howl faded, he turned to his companions. "He's not just hungry for food," Cael said, voice barely above the wind. "He's hungry for memory, for scent, for something lost." Brom looked around. "He?" Cael nodded. "Fenrath. That's what I think he is." Jaren's eyes went wide. "The mythic wolf of the north? That's just legend." "No legend leaves claw marks on trees and eats rabbit stew." The next morning, the people of Elfwyn awoke to find a silver fang laid gently at the edge of the market square, beside a bundle of herbs and a flawless trout. A trade. An offering. And from that day forward, Fenrath did not just haunt the shadows. He guarded them. Cael didn't say anything to the villagers. He simply nodded, packed his cart, and moved on, heading westward down the gravel path, with Beans pulling slow and steady, and the fry pan guard trailing behind. But now, they weren't 4 anymore. They were 5. One stayed in the shadows. One left no footsteps, but wherever Cael set up his fire, Fenrath would be near, watching, waiting, and ready to eat.
The trail out of Elfwyn bent westward toward the Emberpine Ridge, a volcanic slope scattered with geysers, hot springs, and clusters of glowing red stone. The land crackled with buried heat, and the air grew thick with sulfur and steam. Most travelers avoided this path. It was unpredictable, wild, and rumored to be haunted by creatures born of flame. But for Cael, it held one thing that made all the risk worthwhile: salt crystal crags. Nestled among the fissures and vents were deposits of rare mineral salt known for its smoky tang and rich umami. Cael had dreamed of tasting it ever since a wandering dwarven trader passed through the kingdom years ago with a pouch no larger than a fist and sold it for the price of a warhorse. Now, with his cart creaking uphill and beans huffing through the heat, Cael pressed on, sweating beneath his cloak, determined. Behind him, Bram and Jaren wiped their brows with soaked sleeves, while Loke scanned the tree line, ever vigilant. Shadows moved at the edges of the steam, and every now and then they heard the faint, rhythmic padding of something massive moving just out of sight. Fenrath was still following. But not just following, guarding. They reached a plateau near dusk, setting up camp near a bubbling spring that hissed as it spilled over glowing rocks. The air shimmered with heat. Cael peeled off his travel cloak and stretched, then immediately knelt by the fire pit. "No stew tonight, we're grilling." He pulled out thick root vegetables, sliced them thin, and tossed them in a pan with oil and ash salt. The aroma of charred herbs and roasted roots filled the air like a spell. He laid strips of preserved mountain goat over heated stone, letting the fat crackle and sizzle. "Tomorrow, we look for salt pockets. We're close, I can taste it." "That might not be all that's close," Loke said, pointing toward the far ridge. Across the steaming valley, a shape loomed, low to the ground, slinking between vents and geysers. It shimmered in the heat, like a living ember with eyes the color of burning coal. The others rose to their feet, blades drawn, but Cael narrowed his gaze and stayed still. The creature emerged into view, long and serpentine, its scales molten red, horns curved back like flowing magma, and smoke trailing from its nostrils. "A fire drake," Bram whispered. "A big one." "No wings, but fast. That's a ground burner." The creature circled, slow and cautious, watching the camp. Then it growled. Not loud, not threatening, just curious. And then from the trees to the north, another growl answered, deeper, heavier, familiar. Cael turned. Fenrath had stepped into full view, fur bristling, teeth bared, his yellow eyes locked on the fire drake. The two beasts faced each other across the steam-filled clearing, both silent, both still. Tension crackled hotter than the lava vents. Bram whispered, "If they fight, we're dead." Cael didn't move. "They won't." Jaren looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "They're staring each other down, Cael." "They're not predators," Cael said calmly. "They're connoisseurs." He reached into his pack and pulled out 2 bowls. He ladled roasted roots and grilled goat into both. Then slowly, with open hands, he walked into the space between the beasts. One bowl he placed on the scorched stone in front of the drake, the other before Fenrath. Dinner served. The fry-pan guard watched in frozen silence as the 2 ancient beasts inched forward. Fenrath sniffed, ears twitching. The drake flicked its tongue across its snout. Then they ate. First one bite, then another. Fenrath licked the bowl clean. The drake let out a low rumbling snort of satisfaction, tail thudding the ground behind it like a drum roll of approval. Cael sat down between them and took a bite from his own bowl. "See," he said, smiling, "no one has to burn or bite anyone tonight." That night, the fire crackled between 2 monsters and 4 stunned humans. Fenrath lay curled on one side of the cart. Ember, the smaller but still massive, rested near the edge of the hot spring, steam rising around it like a living cloud. Cael named it Ember. The next morning, Ember brought him a gift, a glowing black stone from the deepest volcanic crack. When ground and sprinkled over meat, it gave the food a faint heat and smoky flavor that lingered on the tongue. He called it fire pepper.
As the cart rolled out of the Emberpine Ridge days later, Cael rode at the front, his satchel heavier with salt and spices, and his heart lighter than it had been in years. He had 2 beasts now, both wild, both once feared, and both now fed. News travels faster than carts. By the time Cael and his small caravan of companions rolled into the riverport town of Grellan's Wharf, the whispers had arrived ahead of them. Whispers of a man who tamed Fenrath, the mythic wolf of the north, of a fire drake that followed him through steam and stone, of meals so fragrant that beasts abandoned bloodlust for broth. Some called it a miracle, others madness. But for the Merchant Guild, it was something far more dangerous: disruption. Grellan's Wharf was no ordinary town. It sat at the crossroads of 3 major trade routes, and its markets were protected, regulated by the Central Merchant Guild, a powerful organization that ensured order, profit, and hierarchy. No one set up shop in Grellan without guild approval, and certainly not a wild-eyed, skillet-wielding traveler with mythical creatures shadowing his tent. But for Cael, it held one thing that made all the risk worthwhile: salt crystal crags. Nestled among the fissures and vents were deposits of rare mineral salt, known for its smoky tang and rich umami. Cael had dreamed of tasting it ever since a wandering dwarven trader passed through the kingdom years ago, with a pouch no larger than a fist, and sold it for the price of a warhorse. Now, with his cart creaking uphill and beans huffing through the heat, Cael pressed on, sweating beneath his cloak, determined. Behind him, Bram and Jaren wiped their brows with soaked sleeves, while Loke scanned the tree line, ever vigilant. Shadows moved at the edges of the steam, and every now and then they heard the faint, rhythmic padding of something massive moving just out of sight. Fenrath was still following, but not just following, guarding. They reached a plateau near dusk, setting up camp near a bubbling spring that hissed as it spilled over glowing rocks. The air shimmered with heat. Cael peeled off his travel cloak and stretched, then immediately knelt by the fire pit. No stew tonight, we're grilling. He pulled out thick root vegetables, sliced them thin and tossed them in a pan with oil and ash salt. The aroma of charred herbs and roasted roots filled the air like a spell. He laid strips of preserved mountain goat over heated stone, letting the fat crackle and sizzle. Tomorrow, we look for salt pockets. We're close. I can taste it. That might not be all that's close, Loke said, pointing toward the far ridge. Across the steaming valley, a shape loomed, low to the ground, slinking between vents and geysers. It shimmered in the heat, like a living ember with eyes the color of burning coal. The others rose to their feet, blades drawn, but Cael narrowed his gaze and stayed still. The creature emerged into view, long and serpentine, its scales molten red, horns curved back like flowing magma, and smoke trailing from its nostrils. "A fire drake," Bram whispered. "A big one." "No wings, but fast. That's a ground burner." The creature circled, slow and cautious, watching the camp. Then it growled. Not loud, not threatening, just curious. And then from the trees to the north, another growl answered. Deeper, heavier, familiar. Cael turned. Fenrath had stepped into full view, fur bristling, teeth bared, his yellow eyes locked on the fire drake. The 2 beasts faced each other across the steam-filled clearing, both silent, both still. Tension crackled hotter than the lava vents. Bram whispered, "If they fight, we're dead." Cael didn't move. "They won't." Jaren looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "They're staring each other down, Cael." "They're not predators," Cael said calmly. "They're connoisseurs." He reached into his pack and pulled out 2 bowls. He ladled roasted roots and grilled goat into both. Then slowly, with open hands, he walked into the space between the beasts.
One bowl he placed on the scorched stone in front of the drake, the other before Fenrath. Dinner served. The fry-pan guard watched, in frozen silence, as the two ancient beasts inched forward. Fenrath sniffed, ears twitching.
The sun rose warm and golden over the eastern fields as Cael flipped the first patty of the morning. It sizzled loudly on the cast-iron griddle, the sound drawing a sleepy murmur from the half-dozen villagers already seated nearby. A savory aroma rose into the dawn air, a perfect blend of ground venison, chopped wild garlic, fermented shallot paste, and fire pepper, the smoky volcanic spice Ember had gifted him in the Ember Pine Ridge. Fenrath's tail thudded the ground once in approval. Yes, even the mythic wolf of the north had a weakness: burgers. It had started as an experiment. During their trek north of Grellin's Wharf, Cael had stumbled upon a secluded hamlet called Brambleholt, known for its deer herds and home-fermented sauces. The villagers, initially terrified by the arrival of a man with a fire drake and a mountain-sized wolf at his heels, were quickly won over by the offer of free meals. Nothing bridged fear like food. And the meal that sealed the deal? The Brambleholt burger. The first one Cael cooked vanished in a single gulp. Fenrath had swiped it off the cooling rack before it even hit the plate. Ember had hissed in protest, earning a warning growl from Fenrath. For a tense moment, the campfire flickered between them, the air buzzing with anticipation of a second beast brawl. But instead of snarling, Cael reached into his pack and flipped 2 more patties onto the pan. "Nobody steals burgers," he said, "if there's enough to share." And so began what the locals soon called the Feast of the Fangs. By day 3 in Brambleholt, the fields near the old mill had transformed into a pop-up festival. Families came from neighboring villages. Children rode on Ember's warm, scaly back like a carnival attraction, at least until the drake got bored and wandered off to nap on hot stones. Hunters gifted Cael fresh cuts of meat and fragrant herbs in exchange for food. An old farmer even traded his family's pickled cabbage recipe for a seat by the fire. Cael expanded the menu. Grilled mushroom burgers, roasted beet sliders, spiced lamb patties topped with wild herb yogurt. Each meal was crafted with precision and soul. But it was the Fenrath Deluxe that stole the show. A triple-layered venison patty topped with smoked cheese, honey-grilled onions, crisp greens, and a dash of fire pepper sauce, all served on a pan-toasted sourdough bun. Fenrath devoured it nightly, and woe to anyone who reached for a second before the wolf got his fill. But word travels fast in peaceful places. Too fast. On the 5th evening, just as Cael was caramelizing onions over a fresh flame, a familiar sound broke the mood: the stomp of armored boots and the whinny of royal horses. A patrol from Ireland's capital had arrived. The silver and sapphire crest of the Crown Guard glinted in the dying light. Their captain, a woman with a braid like coiled rope and eyes like flint, stepped forward. "Cael," she said flatly, "the king wants an audience." Cael sighed, dusting his hands. "I already refused 1 crown." She said, "It's not about titles, it's about threats. There are beasts following you." He tilted his head toward Fenrath and Ember, both lounging quietly beside the cart. "They're not following me," Cael said. "They're dining." The captain's brow twitched. "You can't keep treating ancient monsters like house pets." He replied, "I don't. I treat them like guests. That's why they've never hurt anyone." A pause. "Would you like one?" Cael held out a plate. "The onions are extra sweet tonight." The captain stared at him, stunned. Then, hesitantly, she accepted the burger and took a bite. Her eyes widened. She sat down. The Crown Guard left the next morning without incident, well-fed, less afraid, and slightly confused. Cael remained behind for 2 more days, cooking, laughing, and sketching a rough recipe book in the margins of an old map. Fenrath sat by the fire each night, ears flicking contentedly. Ember curled nearby, a wisp of smoke rising with every breath. The two had stopped competing for food. Instead, they waited patiently. Together. Tamed not by sword or sorcery, but by seasoning. Before leaving Brambleholt, Cael added one more burger to the list. The People's Bite, a no-meat pan-roasted veggie patty topped with garlic basil spread and pickled cabbage. He said, "Every soul deserves a good meal. Even if they can't chew venison." He served it for free. As the cart rolled northward toward colder lands and stranger stories, the frying pan guard marched behind it. Fenrath trotted ahead like a silent scout. Ember brought up the rear, tail flicking embers onto the dirt path, and Cael stood at the reins, spatula strapped to his hip. Hero? No, just a man who made burgers so good even legends begged for seconds.
The wind swept across the plateau as Cael's cart came to a slow stop at the edge of the city of Halvenrock, a hilltop settlement known for its proud guild roots, strict culinary rankings, and a legendary tower where only registered chefs were allowed to cook above the second floor. To most, it was a symbol of prestige. To Cael, it looked like an expensive oven stacked vertically. He didn't come for glory. He came for lemons. Halvenrock grew a rare citrus fruit in its terraced gardens, sharp, floral, and slightly sweet, perfect for balancing fatty dishes or cutting through Ember's favorite smoked meats. But the moment Cael entered the market square, something shifted. The crowds didn't gather like they had in Brambleholt or Elthwyn. People stared, whispered. Some pointed, others turned away. "Something's off," Bram muttered. Jaren nodded. "Feels cold, and not in the weather sense." Then the first tomato hit the side of the cart. It wasn't rotten. It was deliberate. "Fraud!" someone shouted. A second tomato splattered across Cael's signboard. "Imposter! Rule breaker! Beast charmer!" The crowd parted as a tall man in jet-black kitchen robes strode forward. His apron was spotless, his boots polished, and on his chest gleamed a silver gild medallion with a flaming fork crossed over a butcher's cleaver. "Hello, Cael," the man said, voice sharp and smooth. "It's been a long time." Cael blinked, then sighed. Rian Thornvale. Once a fellow apprentice in the royal kitchens, now the youngest guild-licensed master chef in Halvenrock, respected, feared, and undeniably skilled. He was also the last person Cael had seen before he walked away from the capital. "You know," Rin said as he circled the cart, "I always wondered what happened to you. While I climbed the ranks, you vanished. And now I find you here, throwing food at monsters and calling it a revolution." "It's not a revolution. It's just dinner." Rian smirked. "The guild says it's disruption. You're serving food without permits, drawing crowds without taxes, and worst of all, stealing attention." "I'm feeding people. That's not a crime." "No," Rian said, stepping close. "But it is insulting." He held up a gloved hand. "So let's settle this the old way." Cael raised an eyebrow. "You're challenging me to a duel?" "A cook-off," Rian clarified. "Tomorrow, sunrise, North Terrace." Jaren's jaw dropped. "He wants to battle you with spatulas?" "It's tradition," Loke muttered. "In Halvenrock, chefs fight for reputation with food. Winner earns rights, loser packs up." Fenrath growled softly. Cael scratched his chin. "And what happens if I win?" Rian smiled tightly. "Then you can cook in peace. For 1 week. But lose. You leave Halvenrock. Forever." Cael nodded slowly. "All right. But you're bringing this on yourself." Rian leaned closer. "Bring your little wolf.
Bring your lizard. Bring every spice you've got. You'll need them. The next morning, the sun rose slow and golden over the north terrace. A crowd had gathered. Traders, nobles, farmers, and food lovers alike. The Halvimak bell rang once, signaling the start. On one side of the terrace, Rian, dressed in pristine chef's whites, standing before a triple-flame guild burner and rows of polished copper tools. On the other, Cael, in his worn brown tunic, a cracked wooden cutting board at his feet, and beans chewing quietly behind him. His only companion, his trusted skillet. Fenrath and Ember sat at the edge of the square like royal judges, silent, unmoving. The challenge was to create a meal using the secret ingredient, chosen at random. The guild officiant stepped forward and unveiled it with a dramatic flourish. Goat's milk. There were murmurs. Goat's milk was notoriously fickle to work with. Too hot, and it curdled. Too cold, and it soared the dish. But Cael only smiled. He'd already begun thinking. Rian moved like lightning, prepping a velvety goat cheese reduction to pair with his signature herbed pasta. His assistants whisked, chopped, and plated with robotic precision. Cael, meanwhile, worked alone. He made fire-grilled flatbread, brushed with garlic and olive oil. Then he whipped the goat's milk with honey and citrus peel until it became a silky mousse. He roasted spiced peaches in a pan of brown sugar and cinnamon, then built it all like an open sandwich. Flatbread on the bottom, mousse in the middle, and caramelized fruit on top. A sweet, savory dish. Unexpected, bold. Rian plated his dish first. Goat cheese ravioli, served with microgreens and aged balsamic drizzle. It gleamed like jewelry on porcelain. Cael plated next. His dish on a slab of warm stone, steam still rising, the scent of roasted fruit and herbs drawing audible sighs from the crowd. The guild judges approached. They tasted Rian's plate, nodded politely, murmured praise. Then they tasted Cael's, and froze. Their eyes widened. One of them blinked rapidly. Another dropped their fork in stunned silence. The head judge cleared his throat. This is comfort. This is nostalgia. This is home. Then he turned to Cael. The win is yours. The crowd erupted. Farmers lifted their hats. Children cheered. Someone even threw a handful of herb sprigs in the air like confetti. Rian stood frozen, jaw clenched, hands tight at his sides. Cael approached him and offered him a hand. Rian stared at it for a long moment, then took it. Still hate you, he muttered. Good. Means you'll keep getting better. Later, as the cart rolled out of Halvenrock with Fenrath trotting contentedly beside it and Ember flicking her tail lazily behind it, Cael looked back once at the tower. He hadn't climbed it, but somehow he'd cooked higher than the top.
They met her in the rain. The road north of Halvenrock had turned slick with mud and mist, a pale drizzle blanketing the trees in silver droplets. The fry-pan guard, cloaked in damp cloaks and soggy boots, pushed the cart up a shallow incline, while Ember grumbled about the lack of sun, and Fenrath padded along silently, more shadow than beast. It was Loke who spotted her first, sitting on a mossy stone by the roadside, cloak pulled tightly over her face, fingers shivering as she tried and failed to light a small fire. "Traveler," he called, "you all right?" She didn't respond immediately. When she did look up, her eyes flickered with something practiced, wary, calculating,
and too clean for a road-worn vagrant. Her hands were blistered but not rough. Her boots, though scuffed, were of expensive make, and beneath her cloak, a hint of embroidery shimmered in the wet light. Definitely not a commoner. But Cael, without hesitation, crouched near her struggling campfire and pulled out a tin of oil and dry tinder. "Let me help." He lit the fire in a single breath. She stared at him wide-eyed. Then, quietly, she said, "Thank you." That night, the cart was parked under the shelter of an ancient tree grove. Rain pitter-pattered on the canopy above, while Cael made a warm root vegetable stew, fragrant with thyme and a pinch of fire pepper for heat. The woman sat near the edge of the circle, face still mostly hidden in her hood, but her eyes followed everything Cael did. Every chop, every stir, every time he added seasoning and stirred counterclockwise instead of clockwise, murmuring something about coaxing the flavor. After 2 spoonfuls of stew, she finally spoke. "This is incredible." Cael smiled. "You're not from around here." She stiffened. "What makes you say that?" "You use the wrong kind of wood for your fire," Cael said, casually. "Your pack has gild-embossed stitching, and your accent slips when you're surprised." The fry-pan guard looked at each other. Fenrath lifted his head slightly. Ember, curled beside the fire, let out a low puff of steam. "Relax," Cael added. "We've had stranger guests." The woman hesitated, then lowered her hood. Her hair was braided gold, her jaw sharp, her eyes a piercing violet, unmistakable. Loke swore under his breath. Jaren dropped his spoon. Bram choked on his tea. Cael said calmly, "You're Princess Selene, first daughter of House Elvenrude, heir to the Summer Throne." She held his gaze. Former heir. Selene explained everything over a second helping of stew. She'd abandoned the court after a failed engagement to a neighboring kingdom. Tired of politics, tired of being handled like silverware. She wanted to see the world beyond her palace walls, to learn life, not in tapestries or texts, but in footsteps and calluses and campfire smoke. "So you're just wandering?" Jaren asked. Ember licked his chops a foot away. "No guards?" Bram hatted. Selene nodded. "Just me, my cloak, and a terrible talent for foraging." She glanced toward Cael. "I'd heard stories of a man who turned down the hero's crown, who tamed a wolf with soup. I didn't believe them, but here I am." "You're still welcome," Cael said simply, offering her a bowl. She took it with both hands. "I won't slow you down. I want to learn." "Learn what?" Loke asked. Selene smiled. "To cook." In the days that followed, Selene became Cael's most enthusiastic student. She was awful at first, burning eggs, over-salting broth, chopping vegetables as if they were plotting rebellion, but she was persistent, curious, and more than anything else, humble. She asked questions. She listened, and when she finally made a rustic herb loaf that Fenrath accepted without growling, the whole camp clapped. Even Ember licked the crumbs. But it wasn't just her cooking that changed things. Selene brought stories of courts and politics, of noble houses secretly obsessed with street food, and of a kingdom that once tried to outlaw garlic. She sketched maps from memory, corrected the fry-pan guard's routes, and once negotiated a toll-free pass through a bandit-controlled ravine just by naming the captain's favorite spice blend. She became family. But with her presence came danger, too. They spotted the first scout 3 days after Selene joined them, watching from the cliffs. Royal trackers. Then came the bounty notice nailed to a tree at a roadside shrine. 1,000 gold crowns for the safe return of Princess Selene. Or her location. That night, as the campfire crackled and Fenrath kept watch at the forest's edge,
Cael sat beside Celine, turning a bundle of rosemary in his hands. "You could go back. They'll forgive you, your royalty." She replied, "I don't want forgiveness. I want flavor and peace like you found." Cael chuckled. "I didn't find peace. I just stopped chasing the wrong things." She looked at him. "Then let me follow the right ones." And so, Princess Celine, traveling cook, noble-born runaway, and heir no more, became the newest member of the Wandering Kitchen. With a pocket full of lemon zest, a stubborn streak as strong as burnt bread, and a growing talent for turning raw ingredients into smiles. Where she once wore silk, she now wore an apron. And where she once wielded titles, she now held a ladle.
It was Celine who noticed the air change first. They had taken a narrow woodland path eastward through the withering pines, guided by an old map she remembered from her royal tutor's study. It promised a shortcut to the port city of Cael, bypassing the treacherous merchant road and cutting 2 days off their journey. But no one remembered mentioning that the path would pass through Hollowmere. The trees changed there, thinner, quieter. The needles on the branches withered prematurely, and the underbrush held no sound, no birds, no crickets, not even wind. The soil beneath their boots turned black and loose, like ash that had forgotten how to burn. And the smell, not of rot or death, but of absence. Bram was the first to break the silence. "I've heard stories," he said, adjusting his pack, "about Hollowmere. Used to be a village here. People just disappeared. All of them. In one night." "Ghosts?" Jaren asked, lowering his voice instinctively. "No," Loke answered. "Worse. Regret." They made camp by a moss-covered stone well near what remained of a crumbling chapel. Fenrath sniffed the edges of the ruins but did not growl. Ember stayed close to a fire, coiled tight, her flames dim and low. Celine lit a lantern and sat close to Cael as he stirred a pot of broth over a fire that seemed reluctant to burn. "What is this place?" she whispered. Cael didn't answer immediately. He tasted the broth, frowned, and added a sliver of wild ginger. Then, softly, he said, "Some wounds don't bleed. Some just echo." That night, strange things happened. They heard footsteps that never approached, whispers with no mouths. Jaren awoke to find his boots facing the opposite direction from where he'd left them. Loke stood a full hour staring at a tree that no one else could see. But Cael cooked. He worked in silence, pulling ingredients from his reserve crate: turnip, barley, bone broth, and a thick clove of garlic crushed beneath his palm. He chopped without haste, measured without scales, and stirred with the precision of someone coaxing life into something long dead. "You're cooking?" Bram asked, nervously, clutching a torch. "In this place?" Cael didn't look up. "Yes." "Why?" "Because something here is still hungry." The soup was ready just after midnight. A thick, aromatic stew, golden and fragrant, infused with warming spices and floating with ribbons of barley and sweet root. Cael ladled a portion into a bowl and walked to the edge of the firelight and placed it on a flat stone near the chapel ruins. Then he stepped back. They waited. The fire cracked. Then, movement. A faint shimmer, like heat waves on a cool night. A shadow took form, hazy and hollow,
a figure in a cloak of torn memory. Its face was blurred, but its posture yearned. It knelt, lifted the bowl, held it like something sacred, and slowly, spoon by spoon, it ate. Celine gripped Cael's arm. "That's a ghost." "No," Cael said quietly. "That's grief." The figure finished, set the bowl down gently, and faded into the mist. And with it, the cold began to lift. The trees rustled again. A bird chirped in the distance. The moss glowed faintly green. Fenrath's ears twitched. Ember stirred, flames rising with new warmth. Something had changed. By morning, the chapel had crumbled further, but the land felt lighter. Cael found the bowl untouched, clean as if washed in a stream. In its place was a bundle of lavender, wrapped in linen. Fresh, fragrant, somehow real. Celine knelt beside him. "You knew that would happen." "No, but I hoped." Jaren stepped forward, staring at the clearing. "We should leave." Cael nodded. "We will, but not before breakfast." He poured the rest of the soup into bowls and handed them out one by one. "To those who left," he said, lifting his bowl. "To those who remain," Celine replied. "To those still healing," whispered Loke. They left Hollowmere with full bellies and a strange, quiet calm. The shortcut had cost them a night of silence, unease, and lingering questions. But in return, Cael had gained something far rarer than time. He had fed a sorrow so old it had no name. And it said, "Thank you."
The first sign of the carnival came with the drums. Not loud war drums, but bright, bouncing rhythms, rolling over the hills like laughter spun into sound. The fry-pan guard crested a slope and saw it. An explosion of color sprawled across the valley below. Canopies of every hue, ribbons on poles, and towering banners with illustrations of giant forks and flaming pots. A man in a mustard-yellow tunic waved from a post by the road. "Welcome to the Iron Ladle Festival," he cried. "The Grand Carnival of Cooks." Jaren blinked. "Wait, this is real?" "I thought it was just a story," Brahm muttered. "It was," Cael replied, "until someone decided to throw spices at tradition." The Iron Ladle Festival was a traveling cooking tournament, a roving collection of chefs, foodsmiths, and culinary performers. It showed up unannounced in a different city every year, stayed a week, and vanished like a fever dream. For those in the know, it was sacred ground, where reputations were forged not with weapons, but with recipes. For Cael, it was nostalgia. He had once wandered through this same carnival as a younger man, before the hero's title was even whispered, back when the only monster he had tamed was a sourdough starter. As the car rolled through the entry gate, lined with spice sellers and knife jugglers, the crowd parted. People stared. Not at Cael, at Fenral, striding calmly beside the cart, tail flicking like a lazy cat, and Ember, drifting smoke from her nostrils, eyes half-lidded with sleepy amusement. Cael simply waved. Celine, now dressed in a floral apron over her travel gear, grinned and whispered to Loki, "I think we just became the main attraction." It didn't take long for the carnival organizers to find them. Cael was approached by a small, wiry woman wearing a robe patterned with sauce stains and gold trim. She introduced herself as Chef Magistrate Yulana, and she wore a ladle like a scepter. "Cael," she said, squinting at him, "I thought you were dead, or king, or both." "Neither," Cael replied, flipping a potato pancake. "Just cooking." "Then cook here. Public duel stage. You've been challenged." He blinked. "Already?" Yulana pointed behind her. "That's him." A lean, sharp-cheeked man stood beside a cart shaped like a shark, knives strapped across his back like a hunter. His apron read, "The Butcher of Briarbank." "He challenged me?" "No," she said. "He challenged whoever's feeding the wolf and the fire lizard. That would be you." The crowd swelled around the center ring by sundown. Banners flapped, jugglers performed, a pair of dwarves tap dance on skillets. And at the heart of it all stood two chefs. On the left, the Butcher of Briarbank, whose specialty was flame-charred meat and showy knife tricks. On the right, Cael, standing beside a simple wooden counter, skillet in hand, a pinch of salt between his fingers. The challenge? Open fire round. No stoves, no tools, just raw ingredients, a campfire, and instinct. The butcher went for flair, slicing meat midair, seasoning with exaggerated twirls, letting flames burst dramatically with each flip. The crowd roared. Cael moved slowly, quietly. He seared trout wrapped in citrus leaves, roasted fennel bulbs until they were sweet and smoky, and topped it all with a reduction made from apple vinegar and wild herbs. He spoke to no one, but every motion whispered story. When he served his plate, it looked plain, until the judges took a bite. The crowd was silent. Then, applause. Slow at first, then faster, roaring. The butcher bowed stiffly. His dish was bold, loud, theatrical. But Cael's told a memory. After the duel, Cael didn't celebrate. He simply ladled soup into bowls for passing children and offered Ember a fried potato she immediately swallowed whole. Yulana found him later. "You're not here for titles, are you?" "Nope." "Then why compete?" Cael looked toward Fenrath, curled near the fire with one paw twitching in a dream. "Because stories deserve witnesses, even if those stories come in the form of a lemon-glazed trout." She smiled, and slipped a gold token into Cael's apron. "The Iron Ladle's Champion's Pass for next year's festival." Cael blinked. "I didn't win the whole thing." "No," she said, "but your food made someone cry. That counts more." That night, fireworks lit the sky over the carnival. Fenrath howled at the sound, low and slow. Ember let off a steam puff that briefly spelled the word burger in the air. The fry pan guard raised mugs, Celine danced with flour still on her cheek, and Cael watched it all with a soft smile, skillet resting at his side, heart full.
The carnival faded behind them like a mirage, colorful, loud, and unforgettable. But as Cael's cart rolled eastward into the highlands of Ardent's Reach, the mood shifted. The path narrowed into steep switchbacks, the wind blew colder, and the sky adopted a pale, unshaken gray. No songs, no banners, just stone and silence. Fenrath grew restless. At night, the giant wolf paced at the edge of the firelight, ears flicking toward sounds only he could hear. He didn't growl. He didn't howl. But he watched the forest, the cliffs, the sky, as if waiting for something to return, or perhaps to be revealed. Even Ember, usually indifferent to everything but food and sunshine, began coiling tighter at night, eyes glowing hotter, tongue flicking the air nervously. Cael noticed, and he said nothing. Not yet. The unease culminated on the third night in the Reach. They had made camp in the shadow of a long-abandoned watchtower. The stone was blackened with time, moss clinging to its cracks like old regrets. Cael had just begun preparing a creamy parsnip soup when Fenrath suddenly stood, rigid, tail stiff, ears pinned back. Then came the sound. a low metallic hum, not of machines or magic, but of control. Chains, dozens of them, clinking just beneath the wind. And then they stepped from the trees. Figures cloaked in ash-gray robes, their faces hidden, their hands extended toward Fenrith. One held a staff embedded with ancient glyphs. The other carried something far worse. A color. Cael stepped forward immediately, skillet in hand, firelight casting long shadows across his brow. "You don't want to do that." The leader's voice was smooth, cold, practiced. "This beast was never yours, cook. He was forged for war, designed for obedience. Your meals have merely dulled the edge. We're here to sharpen it again." Behind him, Fenrith snarled, a sound more broken than fierce. His legs trembled, his ears lowered. Not in submission, in fear. Luke whispered, "He knows them." Celine's eyes narrowed. "Who are they?" "The Order of the Color," Cael said, jaw tight. "Beast binders." The order had long been rumored, mages who specialized in taming the untamable, using ancient runes and dark relics. They didn't train creatures, they enslaved them. And Fenrith had once been theirs, a weapon turned loose on enemy kingdoms, bound in silence, fed on ash and blood. Until somehow he had broken free. Cael never asked how. He only saw what Fenrith had become, not what he had been. But the Order remembered, and now they had come to reclaim their property. Cael stepped between them and Fenrith. "Go," he said quietly, "before something burns." The leader of the Order raised the staff. "You dare interfere with arcane law?" Ember, silent until now, reared up behind the cart, eyes burning bright, tongue flicking red sparks across the dirt. "I don't care for laws," Cael replied, "but I do care for my guests." He slammed the skillet onto the fire with a hiss, sending a wave of scent, garlic, thyme, and parsnip, billowing into the air. Fenrith's ears twitched. He looked toward the fire and remembered. What happened next wasn't loud. There was no roar, no flames, just motion. Fenrith stepped forward. The Order raised the collar, but before they could speak the incantation, Fenrith leapt, not with rage, but resolution. He landed in front of Cael, teeth bared, not at the cook, but at the cloaked captors. He did not attack. He simply stood. A choice. Not a command, not obedience. Freedom. The lead mage faltered. "This isn't possible. You were bound." "No longer," Cael said. "He broke your chains the moment he tasted real food, real kindness, real choice." The fire behind Cael flared, not from magic, but from Ember, who let out a slow hiss of approval, a silent promise that if they reached for the collar again, they'd be ash in the dirt. The Order retreated, slowly, grudgingly, vanishing into the woods with more silence than they had arrived. And just like that, they were gone. Later, Fenrith lay near the fire, head resting on his paws. He was still trembling. Cael knelt beside him, bowl in hand. "I made extra," he said softly. "Parsnip and sage." Fenrith sniffed it once, then devoured it, then licked the bowl, then pressed his nose into Cael's lap. Cael smiled, running a hand through the wolf's thick fur. "You're not a weapon anymore." That night, there were no drums, no festivals, no duels or applause. Just firelight and peace, and a single collar, left behind by the Order,
now melted into slag beside the skillet.
The winds that blew through the mountain valleys in the days after Fenrath's defiance were different. Not colder, not harsher, quieter. Like the world itself had exhaled. But for Cael, the silence wasn't peace. It was a calling. He stood at the edge of a wide cliff one morning, a steaming cup of broth in hand, watching Fenrath sleep beside the remains of last night's fire. The wolf still twitched in his sleep, as if somewhere deep inside, chains still rattled. Ember curled close, not to guard, but to warm. Selene approached from behind. "He's changed." Cael nodded. "No, he's changing. It's not the same." "What do you mean?" "He's not just free. He's looking for something now. Like, he wants to know who he is, when he's not being told what to be." Selene was quiet for a while. "I know that feeling." They continued their journey eastward, following scattered ruins and forgotten paths. But everywhere they went, the road left traces, not of the Order, but of others like Fenrath. The first sign was a cave high in the stone hills near Myros Bend. Inside they found scratch marks, too deep for a bear, too wide for a man. Ember sniffed the air and turned away, disturbed. Fenrath paced the entrance, but did not enter. Then they found the bones. Not human, not beast. Bound. Still wearing fragments of collars. Runes etched into stone walls, long faded by time and moss. Cael stood before one such stone and whispered, "How many of you were there?" Fenrath didn't answer. He didn't need to. That night, Cael prepared something he hadn't cooked in years. A dish so gentle, so soul-warming, that it had once been served to grieving widows in the capital during the month of mourning. Silken root porridge, made with foraged carrots, barley, goat's milk, and a dash of cinnamon. Cooked low and slow over steady heat. Stirred only clockwise. No salt, no spice, just warmth. He left bowls near 3 stone markers outside the cave, and one in front of Fenrath. The great wolf stared at it for a long time. Then, slowly, began to eat. The days that followed became a pilgrimage. Every village they passed held a story of creatures long vanished, monsters defeated, or curses that left towns too quiet. Cael listened. He didn't correct them, but at night he left meals behind in the wild, small ones, always warm, always shared. A bowl of bone broth near a riverbank where an angry spirit once drove fishermen away. A plate of spiced turnips on a forest's tump where a devil elk was last seen. Flatbread baked on river stones beside the ruins of a village devoured by wolves. The food was always gone by morning, but never disturbed, always finished. Bram finally asked, "You think they're still out there? Like Fenrath?" "I don't know, but I think they deserve the chance to remember who they were, even if it's just through one bite." "You think that's enough?" Cael paused. "I think it's a start." The fry-pan guard began helping. Selene drew maps marking each place they found signs, old tracks, broken chains, carvings on stone walls. Loke prepared herbal teas meant to calm beastly nerves. Jaren crafted a stew he named Second Chance Soup. It wasn't perfect, but Ember stole a sip when he wasn't looking. He still talks about it. Even Fenrath began to change. He no longer slept far from the camp. He lay his head on Cael's cloak. He barked, not growled, at the sunrise. And once, when they passed a frightened stag, he simply looked and let it run. He was still enormous, still ancient, but he was gentle. Then came the letter, carried by a falcon wearing the king's crest. Cael read it by firelight. He said nothing for a long while. "What is it?" Selene asked. Cael folded the letter. An invitation. To what? To return. To be recognized. To finally wear the title I walked away from. Bram looked up. "They want you to be hero again?" Cael nodded. "You going?" Cael smiled. "I already am." He knelt beside the fire, scooped out a bowl of red lentil curry, placed it near the fire's edge, and let the scent rise into the night. Somewhere in the dark, a pair of unseen eyes blinked, not with hunger, but with hope.
The mountains gave way to canyonland, jagged ridges and stone arches sculpted by time and heat. Wind howled between cliffs like a flute played by a lonely god. The sun glared harshly on rock, and the ground was dry enough to snap underfoot. Here, Ember felt at home. She moved more confidently in the red light, tongue flicking the dust, curling around boulders like a river of heat. Fenrath, by contrast, stayed close to the shadows, his massive frame more cautious than usual. Cael rode the cart slowly through the narrowest paths, stopping to set up camp when the air grew too heavy. They were deep in Serpent's Maw, a place few maps dared to name, let alone mark. Locals spoke of something vast living here, something old, and always hungry. They smelled the sulfur first, then the scorched brush. Not from Ember, her flames were hot, but precise. This was chaotic, uncontrolled. The ground was blackened in circles. Trees had been twisted and melted like wax figures. Cael crouched low and touched the ash. "Not natural," he said. This was recent. "Could it be another drake?" Selene asked. Ember answered with a low hiss. "Not fear. Recognition." They made camp on a plateau rimmed by stone pillars. Cael roasted cactus fruit and dry root with cumin and vinegar, the scent rising to the stars. That night, it came. Not like Fenrath, not in silence, but with the sound of the world breaking. The mountains shook as something massive slithered through the rock below, scales like black steel, eyes like magma, mouth lined with smoke and teeth and memory. It didn't roar. It breathed, a low exhale that melted stone. Ember growled, posture shifting from lazy to alert. Her body flared with sudden heat, and she slithered forward, protective. Fenrath stepped beside her. The creature emerged from the canyon wall like a ghost peeling from old paper. It was twice Ember's size, coiled and cracking with heat, its scales fractured, scarred. This was no wild beast. This was Obereth, the Flame Eater. Cael stood his ground. He didn't shout, didn't reach for his pan. He simply took a breath and began slicing garlic. Selene hissed under her breath, "You're cooking now?" "She's not here to kill," Cael said. "Not yet. She's starving." The creature loomed, eyes locked on Ember, flickering with something deeper than threat. Jealousy, recognition, loss. The story of Obereth was old, told in fragments. A guardian once, like Fenrath, until a kingdom tried to bind her flames. They failed. She fled, and in her grief she devoured. Villages, armies, whole forests. Not out of rage, but to fill the void left by betrayal. She hadn't eaten. She had consumed. Cael threw chopped cactus onto the pan. It sizzled. He added fire pepper, vinegar-soaked beans, and honey-glazed mushrooms. Then he stirred in a paste Ember had helped him craft days earlier, made from crushed ember root and dried citrus ash. The scent rolled over the plateau, spicy, tangy, rich. Obereth paused. Her tongue flicked once, then twice. Cael stepped forward and placed a bowl of steaming, fiery stew on a flat stone between them. He bowed, Not as a warrior, not as a master, but as a host. Oberith inched forward, every movement a thunder. The frypan guard watched in terrified awe. Selene gripped Cael's shoulder. "If this goes wrong, she burns us all," he said. "Yes." Oberith lowered her head, sniffed the bowl. Then, slowly, she opened her mouth and breathed fire, directly onto the bowl. For one terrifying second, everyone ducked, but Cael watched calmly. When the fire cleared, the stew remained, unburnt, still simmering. Ember hissed low. Oberith tasted it. Then, without a word, she ate. Not fast, not wild, deliberately. When the bowl was empty, she raised her head, stared directly at Cael, and dipped her massive neck in the faintest of bows. Then, with a whisper of flame and a shudder of stone, she vanished into the canyon once more, leaving only melted rock, rising steam, and an untouched sprig of scorched basil. A gift. Cael sat down, exhaling deeply. Jaren was still frozen. "You just fed the flame eater." Loke muttered, "She blessed the food before eating, like it was sacred." Bram pointed, "That's your thing, Cael." Selene just stared at the scorched basil. "She didn't burn the food, she finished it. That wasn't rage, that was ritual. That was ritual." Cael nodded. "She remembers what it's like to be revered, but also what it means to be fed with care. That's something she lost." That night, Ember lay near Cael, curling around the fire, eyes half closed. Fenrath, too, was still. And somewhere in the distance, the canyon walls glowed faintly, not with destruction, but with warmth. Oberith had returned to her flames, not as a monster, but as a memory reawakened by broth and fire.
It began with the flutter of a banner caught in the wind, tattered but unmistakable, an old sigil, stitched in silver and blue, the crest of the king's vanguard. Cael found it lodged between rocks by a stream, half buried in moss and thyme. He stared at it for a long while, not because it surprised him, but because it didn't. The past was catching up, and it wore armor. The frypan guard had just set up camp near the base of the hill village called Wren's Fold, quiet, out of the way, surrounded by wheat fields and friendly goats. Selene was teaching Jaren how to make preserved lemon paste, while Loke carved new soup ladles. Fenrath watched over the hilltop. Ember sunbathed on a boulder. Then the riders came. Not many, just 3. But their armor gleamed like the dawn. Their cloaks bore royal thread, and the woman leading them was someone Cael knew well. Sir Elira Voss, once second in command of the royal vanguard. Stern, loyal, tireless. She dismounted with grace, eyes already fixed on Cael. "Hero," she said. "Not anymore," Cael replied, wiping his hands on a cloth. "You never stopped being one. I just started cooking. Then I hope your skillet's still sharp." They sat near the fire that evening, bowls in hand, roasted tomato bisque with smoked lentil crumble and a sprig of thyme. Elira didn't eat at first. She stared at the bowl like it was a challenge. But one sip, and her shoulders dropped. "I had forgotten how warm food can feel," she admitted, "even after everything." Cael smiled faintly. "That's why I make it." Then her face darkened. "There's trouble, Cael, at the border." She spoke of new tensions, a faction of nobles stirring old ambitions, border villages burned, scouts missing, rumors of creatures, twisted, unnatural, perhaps failed creations of the order that once tried to reclaim Fenrath. They say they're using forbidden binding again, but cruder, faster, less stable. She paused. They need a symbol to unite behind. And people keep talking about you. Cael stirred the fire slowly, letting the sparks rise. I left that world behind. But it hasn't left you, she said. Your name is on the wind. You've done more with soup than some kings with armies. You've tamed beasts. You've fed grieving ghosts. You even brought ember to the side of peace. She leaned forward. They need you. Later, Celine found him alone by the ridge, staring at the horizon. They're calling. I know. What are you thinking? Cael didn't answer at first. He picked a sprig of sage, rolled it between his fingers. I walked away from swords. I chose flavor over fire. But now people are starving for peace again. And maybe this time, he looked at her, maybe I don't have to pick one or the other. The next day, the decision was made. Cael packed more supplies. Extra salt, extra spices, a new skillet forged by a blacksmith he once saved with broth and basil. Celine sketched maps of the troubled regions. The fry-pan guard reinforced the cart. But something had changed. They weren't running anymore. They were marching. Not as soldiers, but as healers. Before leaving Wren's fold, Cael cooked one more meal for the villagers, a humble porridge made with honeyed oats, nutmeg, and fruit compote from their own orchards. He called it Hope in a Bowl. He left behind the recipe, written carefully in charcoal on parchment, because no matter where the next road led, someone had to keep feeding the quiet places. That night, as they made their way through the valley, Cael heard it again, soft at first, like a hum in the trees. Whispers. Is that him? The cook hero? They say he fed a dragon. They say his soup stops wars. He smiled, but didn't turn around. He didn't need to, because the world was watching now, and his fire was just getting started.
The winds came first, heavy, unsettled, like lungs drawing breath before a scream. The skies darkened over the highland plains of Brelmar, casting long shadows across the rolling grass. Thunder murmured low in the distance, not from the clouds, but from the steady march of something unseen. The border war hadn't begun, but everyone felt it coming, and so did Cael. He chose the hill, a flat rise overlooking the trade road where caravans once passed freely, now abandoned save for crows and dry leaves. The old stones of a ruined watchpost sat at the summit. There, with the fry-pan guard around him, Cael unpacked his cart. He didn't sharpen weapons, he lit fires. The sky above was gray. Soldiers, nervous and lean, had begun gathering at Brelmar's forward camp just beyond the tree line. Not regular army, but volunteers, farmers, refugees, retired fighters who still remembered which way to hold a spear. Most hadn't eaten properly in days. Some hadn't eaten warm and longer. When they saw the smoke rising from Cael's hill, many assumed it was another supply fire. Until the scent hit them. He cooked everything. Stew thick with smoked barley and buttered leeks, roasted squash and spiced lentils with crispy onions, flatbread charred over flame, brushed with garlic oil and wild herbs. Tail moved without pause, chopping, stirring, tasting. Ember heated the stones. Fenrith kept watch, ears constantly twitching at sounds from the forest. Celine directed the line. Jaren poured broth with a grin and a quip for every bowl. Bram added sliced pickles and told nervous soldiers the story of how Cael once outcooked the noble for control of a tower. Loke sharpened ladles like knives and arranged plates like ritual offerings. No one asked for payment. No one turned away. They called it the last meal before the march. And it wasn't just food. It was grounding. The young man whose brother had disappeared in a scouting raid finally smiled as he chewed his third flatbread. The woman who hadn't spoken in 2 days laughed when Ember gently warmed her boots with a flick of her tail. Even the hardened captain of the volunteer force, his armor mismatched and scarred, stood still for a long moment, holding a bowl of hot broth in both hands, as if afraid it might vanish. At the edge of camp, Illyra Voss approached the firearms crossed. "You always feed people like this the night before a fight?" Cael stirred a pot of root vegetable mash and looked up. "No. Only when I want them to remember what they're fighting for." She nodded, quietly accepting a plate. That evening, Cael made one final dish, served only to those who stayed after sundown, a wild mushroom and chestnut stew with soft herb dumplings. The kind of food you remembered for years, not for its complexity, but for the feeling it left behind. Warmth. Safety. Home. Before bed, Celine sat beside him by the embers of the fire. "You fed an army," she said. "I fed people," Cael replied, watching the smoke drift. "They're going to follow you, you know, after this." "I don't want followers," he said softly. "I want people to know they deserve better than fear, even the ones headed into battle." She looked at him, eyes shining in the firelight. "You've become something more than a hero, Cael." He shook his head, smiling faintly. "I'm still just a cook." But far beyond the trees, on the other side of the border, something watched. A twisted mockery of Fenrath, bound by broken runes, its eyes hollow, its limbs too long, and behind it a commander in black steel armor sipped from a flask and spat. "The cook thinks soup will save them. We'll see how long they last once the chain beasts arrive." The storm would come. But before it did, Cael had fed the fire in every soul on that hill. Not just with calories, but with reminders of laughter, of stories, of meals that tasted like hope. And in the morning, when the first horns blared and blades were drawn, every person who had sat beside Cael's fire would rise a little taller, not because they were ready to kill, but because they remembered they were worth saving.
The first strike came at dawn. A distant horn, a thud in the earth, then a roar, deep and warped, that echoed off the cliffs like an animal trapped inside a cathedral. The fry-pan guard rose from their bedrolls as the valley trembled. From the tree line came the sound of marching, dozens, maybe hundreds of heavy footfalls, but they weren't organized, they weren't disciplined. They staggered. And when the enemy came into view, everyone froze. Because they weren't soldiers, they were monsters. Cael stood on the ridge with Illyra and Celine beside him, staring down at the advancing tide. Twisted creatures, patched together with bone and spellwork, wolves with too many legs, birds with metal grafts instead of wings, and leading them, 3 colossal beasts with runes seared into their flesh, eyes dull, frothing at the mouth. Chain beasts. The Order's broken pets. Fenrath growled low. Ember hissed so hot, the grass beneath her feet crisped. "They're bound," Cael murmured, but barely. Whoever did this didn't finish the work. "They're unstable, more tormented than trained," Alicera added. Illyra gripped her blade. "Doesn't matter. They're still coming." Cael nodded. "Then we don't start with swords." He turned. "We start with supper."
As Illyria's vanguard formed their ranks and the village defenders readied their makeshift barricades, Cael moved fast. He wheeled the cart to the front lines, directly in the path of the oncoming storm, and began to cook. The first dish, spiced marrow rice with bloodroot glaze. The scent of simmering broth floated down the slope. The second, lamb fat flatbread with citrus smoke. Ember helped with the charring. The third, bone broth with fermented garlic and a dash of ash pepper. Fenrath stood guard beside the bubbling pot. The monsters drew closer. Closer. And then they paused. The front line of beasts, disoriented by hunger and haze, smelled it, and for a moment they hesitated. The lead chain beast, a wolf-bear hybrid with eyes like dead glass, stepped forward. Its breath came in heaves, its body shook beneath the weight of broken runes. Cael did not run. He ladled a bowl of broth and walked toward it. One step, then another. Fenrath growled low in protest, but did not move. Cael stopped just feet from the beast and held out the bowl. No fear, just offering. The chain beast trembled. Its nose twitched. Then it slumped, collapsed, groaning onto the ground. The bowl clattered, the broth spilled, the creature didn't move. Not dead, just released. All at once, chaos erupted behind it. One of the chain beasts roared and charged. Illyria shouted for shields. But before they clashed, Ember lunged. A flash of heat, a wall of flame. Not to burn, to block. The beast skidded to a stop, growling, now confused. Cael stood in front of it again, lifting a second bowl. This time, two beasts approached. And again, they did not strike. They sniffed. They remembered. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a slow collapse. One by one, the chain beasts faltered, not from wounds, but from recognition, from hunger, from smell, from choice. And those who could not be reached were protected by the defenders, by Fenrath, by Illyria and her vanguard. Not as conquerors, but as shields. Hours passed, and when the dust settled, the Order's forces had fallen into disarray. Their magic, rushed, cruel, had turned against them. The chain beasts they unleashed had not met swords. They had met a meal, and it had reminded them of something deeper than commands, something human. That evening the hill was quiet again. The wounded were few, the frightened had steadied, and the fire at the center of camp burned higher than ever. Cael stirred a pot slowly, a new recipe. Freedom stew. Made from the leftover marrow, broth thickened with lentil leaf and lemon leaf, topped with herbs gathered from the scorched field. Selene sat beside him, watching the stars return. "You turned an army," she whispered. "No," Cael said, handing her a bowl. "I fed it." Later that night, he walked alone to the edge of the field where the freed chain beasts now slept, scattered, breathing, peaceful. He placed a bowl beside each one, not to tame them, not to win them, but to honor them, because even monsters deserve a last meal before becoming more than monsters. They called him many names now: Beast Whisperer, Flame Tamer, the cook who ended a war. But to the villagers who stood at the foot of Brelmar Hill days after the dust had settled, Cael was still the man who handed them soup before they even remembered they were hungry. The Order's ranks had shattered. Their rituals, unstable, cruel, had unraveled in the face of something older than spellwork: hospitality. The freed chain beasts had wandered off into the hills, some following Fenrath's scent, others disappearing into deep glades where they could rest without fear. Those too broken to walk had remained near the camp, fed daily by Cael and tended by Selene and Loke, who now carried bundles of herbs like sacred relics. Even the vanguard stayed, not as guards, but as students. Jaren taught them to cook fire-roasted beans with rosemary. Bram shared his hard-earned method for pickling turnips in salt brine. Ember, now adored by children across 5 villages, allowed 3 toddlers to nap on her sun-warmed back. Fenrath became the camp's unofficial perimeter. No one approached without his silent permission. The battlefield had become a kitchen. And Cael? He was tired, but content. That morning, a royal envoy arrived. Velvet robes, gleaming boots, and a scroll sealed with the golden wax of the crown itself. Sir Illyra Voss stood tall at Cael's side as the herald cleared his throat. By command of the High Court of Erilon and the Council of 5, the Kingdom of Valerian does hereby restore all honors, titles, and privileges to the one known as Cael the Flamebearer, First of the Fork, Knight of the Northern Fire, Hero of the Final Table. The herald unrolled a silk sash embroidered with threads of gold and red. Should you accept, you will be seated on the council as culinary advisor and keeper of flame-bound beasts. Cael stared at the scroll, then at the sash, then at his skillet, blackened at the edges, a small dent on one side, seasoned with years of joy and regret. No. The herald blinked. No! Cael smiled gently. I appreciate the gesture, truly, but I already have a council. He gestured to the fry-pan guard, currently teaching local farmers how to make flatbread without burning the bottom. To be honest, I'd rather be keeper of the campfire. That night, they held a feast, not of politics or position, but of people. Tables made from old planks stretched across the ridge. Bowls of wild mushroom soup, smoked squash, and rosemary rice passed from hand to hand. The air was thick with laughter, the warm clink of mugs, and Ember snoring softly in the background. Cael stood behind the cart, as he always had, wiping his hands on his apron, making sure everyone was fed before he even took a bite. Selene appeared beside him, holding a small plate of his own cooking. Eat, she said, for once. Cael took the plate and smiled. Is that an order, princess? She raised an eyebrow. Only if you want it to be. He chuckled. You ever think we'd end up here? On a hill surrounded by reformed beasts, ex-bandits turned cooks, and a legendary drake curled around a bread oven? She glanced around. Yes, it suits us. As the fire crackled and music drifted lazily into the night, Cael finally sat. Not at the head of the table, not on a throne, just beside his friends, his family, his fire. And the wind that once carried rumors of war now carried something new, a tale of a man who could tame monsters, not with steel, but with seasoning.
The hills were green again. Brelmar's plains, once charred and shadowed, now swayed with new wildflowers. Soft blues, pale pinks, golden stalks glinting in the breeze. Birds returned to their nests. The trees, once scorched and cracked, bloomed with cautious hope. And on the far side of the valley, where the wind met the stone, Cael stood beside his cart, gazing down at a dirt road that twisted toward the distant horizon. The war was over, but the journey wasn't. It had been 2 weeks since the last of the chained beasts wandered into the eastern glades to live unbound. The order had vanished.
its tower found abandoned, its texts burned, its altars cold. No more callers, no more monsters. Just stories now. Stories told by children who rode Ember like a mountain pony. Stories whispered by ex-soldiers warming soup over coals. Stories sung by farmers under lanterns, where Cael's name wasn't spoken like a hero, but like a blessing. The fry pan guard had grown. Bram and Jaren opened a permanent food stall in Grellan's Wharf. They named it the Second Serving. Loke took a group of teenage apprentices to teach them the warrior's way of the wooden spoon. Fenrath remained at Cael's side, quieter now, gentler, though still large enough to cast shade on a small cottage. Ember, well, she flew. Not far, just above the hills, stretching her wings once a week with a slow, burning arc that lit up the sky. And Selene? She stayed. Because she had already run away from one home. Now she'd built another. Cael had refused 3 titles in the past fortnight: Hero Emeritus, Flame-Bound Chancellor, and High Chef of the Realm. He accepted one thing, a quiet letter of recognition from the king himself, scribbled on the back of a recipe for winter squash pie. Cael framed it beside his pantry, not because it meant much, but because the king had crossed out the sugar amount and written, "Try cinnamon instead."
And now the cart was packed again. A new skillet, fresh herbs wrapped in cloth, a jar of Ember's smoked salt, an envelope with a list of forgotten villages in the north, places too small to appear on most maps, places where people still went hungry. Selene adjusted the straps on the side of the cart, her apron tied tight over traveling leathers. "You really think they need us up there?" Cael smiled. "I don't know, but I think they deserve a hot meal either way." Fenrath yawned beside them, tail flicking dust across the road. Ember snorted and nudged the cart forward impatiently, eager to move. "Do we have enough lentils?" Selene asked. "We always have enough lentils. And the honey? I triple-packed it. You eat like a bear in spring." She elbowed him. He grinned. They passed the edge of Brelmar by noon. Locals waved. A few threw herbs. One elderly woman offered Cael a fresh-baked pie in case the next villages got no manners. He bowed deeply. That's the best kind of armor. The cart creaked along the path. The hills fell behind. And ahead, open road. No banners, no horns, just sky, dust, and the promise of someone, somewhere, waiting to be fed. They stopped at sundown. A young boy and his little sister waved them down from a crossroads inn where the cook had fallen ill. The inn's guests had gone without supper. "Could you, maybe—" the boy asked shyly. Cael stepped down from the cart. "I'll make stew." He didn't ask for coin. He didn't ask for names. He simply took out his pan and began to cook. And as the stars bloomed overhead, as the smell of garlic and rosemary drifted into the night, as Fenrath lay near the fire and Ember warmed the pots with one careful puff, Cael looked out into the dark and smiled, because this was the real crown: a fire, a meal, a quiet road home.
And so, the tale of Cael, the hero who turned down glory for garlic, who traded a blade for a skillet, and who tamed the world's most feared beasts with the simple act of feeding them, comes to its end. But endings are funny things, because a cook's road is never truly finished. There will always be another forgotten village, another weary traveler, another fire to light, and another pot to stir. Cael didn't need a crown. He didn't need statues or songs. He only needed a flame, a handful of good ingredients, and someone, anyone, willing to sit and share a meal. Because he believed something no war ever could, that warmth changes people, that kindness, when seasoned just right, can silence monsters, and that food, real food, has the power to remind the world of what it forgot, that we are more than what we fight. We are what we share. So if one day you find yourself at the edge of a lonely path, and you smell roasted squash, fire-roasted lentils, or chestnut stew, follow it. You might just find a cart, a drake curled around a stew pot, a massive wolf watching the horizon, and a man behind the fire, apron dusted with flour, ladle in hand. If you do, sit down. He's already making enough for two.